Hello, this is Claire Howell from the Skagit Fisheries Enhancement Group. Today we're going to look at the fry stage of the salmon life cycle. Here is the sketch that we're going to work from today. We have our juvenile salmon, which have now reached the stage of life called the fry stage. At this time, they're still young, they're still juveniles, small fish. However, they've left the gravel nests, the red, and they're now living freely in the creek. So I'm going to get started by just adding in the base coloration on the body of this top fry. As I do this, you can think about how the salmon looks different in this stage of its life from when we last saw it when it was an olivine in the red. Putting in some olive green at the top of the head. I'm also going to put some water into this caudal fin, the tail fin. One of the things you might have noticed is that at this stage, the salmon has all of its fins. They've all grown strong so that they can use them to swim in the creek, to escape predators, and to find food. And so this is the caudal fin right here, the tail fin. It's putting a little bit of base color in. I'll go through and I'll fill it in later. Here's the adipose fin. This is how you can tell it's a salmonid, so related to salmon or trout. This little fin right here at the back by the tail is called the adipose fin. Next we have the dorsal fin, and the coho has a little white patch on the top of the fin, just a little highlight right at the top. So I'm going to leave that blank. That's the fin that the fish uses to hold itself well balanced in the water as it swims. And here we have our bottom fins. We have the pectoral fin, and the pelvic fin, and the anal fin. And all of these fins will be used by the fish to swim, to turn left and right, like the pectoral fin, and to stay well balanced in the water, as well as to propel itself forward. So where the fish gets all the force that it uses to swim forward in the water is by moving its tail fin, that caudal fin, back and forth. So that is a very critical fin for the survival of the fish. Yeah, something else that's interesting about the adipose fin, that was this one right here, is that this fin is actually not known to provide a survival function for the fish. It's possible it has something to do with sensing currents, but it's not known for sure, and the fish will survive if this fin is removed. So when fish are raised at hatcheries, they'll actually clip off this fin, and that way they'll be able to tell that the fish was raised from a hatchery when the adult comes back to the fresh water. Now it is time to block in some of the color of these pieces of wood that are submerged in the water. You'll see that I'm making it kind of an olive green foundation. And that's because the wood isn't exposed directly during the spring and the summertime. This is taking place in the summertime. The wood is covered in algae, macrophytes, like aquatic plants. So it's going to have a nice olive green base coat, which I will use to build up the plants. Okay. Part of what's so important in the ecosystem about these pieces of wood with the macrophytes growing on them is that they provide food for aquatic insects, such as this stonefly. Just carefully working around the edge of the stonefly, and I'll go back through and connect this base coat up closer so that there isn't a little halo around the fly at the end. So this stonefly is a juvenile. It's what we call a nymph, and it will feed on the algae. It might munch a little bit on the decomposing wood, and it will grow and it will actually provide food for these juvenile salmon. So this here is quite a large stonefly. I think this salmon would struggle to eat it, but when these stoneflies are smaller or when the fry are bigger, they would love to eat any sort of aquatic insect that they could fit in their mouth. So we call these aquatic insects macroinvertebrates, which also includes other invertebrates like snails, worms that aren't actually insects. So snails and worms are actually two different types of organisms. Snails are mollusks, and worms are once again a variety. So one of them, like a segmented worm, would be an annelid. And you also have nematode worms, and quite a lot of diversity of worms actually. Alright, so I'm going to put this down for a moment and get the border around our stonefly nymph nice so we don't have a weird pattern form. I'm adding the base coat of golden yellow to this stonefly nymph. These stoneflies are actually pretty sensitive organisms, so they need water that has a lot of oxygen in order to survive. So something that scientists can do when they're looking to see if a habitat is good for salmon, they can go and look for organisms like this stonefly. Because if the stonefly population is doing well, then it means that there's lots of good oxygen, and it's likely that it would be a good habitat for salmon. So we call these, as well as other macroinvertebrates like mayflies and caddisflies, indicator species, meaning that their presence in the habitat indicates, in this case, good levels of oxygen. Now I'm adding in the foundation color, light blue, for the water. This painting's going to take place in the summer, like I mentioned earlier. So I'm going to try and do this nice light and even foundation, and then maybe add in some light coming in through the water once I have this down. So salmon are all born in fresh water. That's a universal part of their life cycle between all of the different species. If you can recall, we have 5 Pacific salmon species here. And then we also have some trout species, which are called salmon. So they'll also have that adipose fin, that fin right above the tail fin. And they are also all born in fresh water. But then, the amount of time that the salmon spends in the freshwater and what sort of habitat it uses when it's in the freshwater will begin to differ once the alevin have matured and left the red. So some salmon will stay in the freshwater for a year, sometimes more, and some of them will head straight out to sea. And this variation can be on a species level. For example, chum salmon will go straight out to sea after the little fry emerge from the red, whereas coho salmon will stay for about a year in the freshwater, where they will eat those macroinvertebrates and get a little bit bigger and stronger before they leave the freshwater for the ocean. We call those strategies life histories. You can kind of think of a life history as like how the organism accomplishes what it needs to do to survive. So how it finds food, how it finds a mate, how it has a good habitat, finds good territory, and defends that territory. All of that would be part of its life history. So once again, these are going to be coho salmon, so they'll be staying in the fresh water for about a year. Here you can see our completed salmon fry. They've completely absorbed the yolk from the alevin stage, as well as grown those nice fins so that they can swim successfully in the creek. We've also developed some coloration, some parr marks, as well as other dark colors like that dark green and browns, so that they can better camouflage into the creek environment. You can see that while they are able to swim freely in the creek, they're still taking some shelter. So looking out here at the environment a little bit more, you can see that they're sheltering in and around some woody debris, so branches and sticks that have fallen from the trees along the bank of the creek into the creek. And these branches are very important for the habitat of the salmon fry. You can see this macroinvertebrate, the stonefly, is feeding on some algae and making use of that woody debris as well as the salmon fry. These sorts of macroinvertebrates are a very important food source for the salmon fry. As I'm sure you remember, these salmon fry are carnivores. In fact, at all stages in the salmon's life, they are carnivores, which means that they only eat meat. They don't eat plants, so these little fish, they wouldn't go over and munch on the algae on the log, but they would munch on the stonefly eating the algae on the log. Also, another important thing about the logs is that they're providing shelter to the salmon fry. These are still small fish, and they're quite vulnerable to predation. So any sort of predator in the creek environment, like larger fish, or I've added a predator into our scene up here, any sort of bird, a fish-eating bird, would happily eat those salmon fry. So this here, let's go ahead and get started on it, is a belted kingfisher. You might have seen these birds if you've gone along the side of a creek. They'll often fly down the creek if you frighten them, making a sort of loud scolding call. They're quite easy birds to locate because as they fly, they make that sound. Not very stealthy birds. And these birds will sit on branches above the creek, and then they'll dive down, catching any sort of little fish or frog or whatever they see that would be a good meal for them. So I think I'm going to put this down, and I'm going to put in the base colors for our belted kingfisher. I've added the base color into the top part of the wings for our kingfisher, and now I'm just carefully putting a little bit of detail onto the flight feathers. As this dries, I'll go back over it and kind of round out the detail. And I'm going to put in the darker colors to pull the shape nicely together. So I'll stop filming so that I can do that while concentrating, because I don't want to mess up my kingfisher right at the end of this painting. Here is our completed painting for the fry stage of the salmon life cycle. Here we have two salmon fry living in the creek. They've left the protection of the gravel red, the nest, and now they are making their own way in the environment, where they're hunting for food like this macroinvertebrate. They're taking shelter under branches and logs and this woody debris, and they're avoiding predators like this belted kingfisher. So here is the environment for this fry stage of the coho salmon life cycle. And next, we're going to take a look at what happens once it's time for these fish to leave the freshwater and start moving towards the saltwater. So I'll hope that you can join me for that. And for now, I'll say goodbye and thank you very much. Have a wonderful day. Bye.